Hi there, and welcome. My name is Jeff Bell, and on behalf of McLean Hospital, I'd like to thank you for your interest in our educational webinar series. Our focus today, grief and loss. This is a universal topic to be sure. It's also an especially important one. Losing someone or something we care deeply about is never easy, and grief is certainly a natural response, but sometimes processing that grief can be extremely difficult and can lead to prolonged challenges. Our guest today is someone who can help us understand how to manage our grief in constructive ways. Dr. Susan Block is an institute physician in the Department of Psychosocial Oncology and Palliative Care at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and Brigham and Women's Hospital. She is also a professor of psychiatry and medicine at Harvard Medical School and truly a pioneer in the field of palliative medicine. Susan, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start with some definitions. Grief and loss. For purposes of our conversation today, how would you define those two terms?
Grief, I would define as the emotional response to a loss of an animal, a pet, and an idea, a role. It has kind of many different meanings in the sense that it is applied to different objects, but it's the emotional reactions to having something, particularly something deeply valued, disappear from your life.
When we talk about sources of grief, so often we talk about the loss of a loved one, but it's a much wider net that encapsulates the folks who, and inanimate objects as well, that can be the sources of our grief.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Jeff. And that while when we think of grief, we tend to think of the loss of a very close loved one, it can apply to many different sort of facets of life. I think for many people, the first experience with loss and grief are with a pet who dies perhaps in childhood or adolescence. And the feeling of emptiness, of sorrow, of change, of even perhaps fear or anxiety that comes with the loss are in our culture not necessarily acknowledged fully, but that they're individual responses that we have that go very, very deep. Sometimes people lose a job, and there's a lot of grief associated with that. A lot of there's a role that's been lost. There's income that might have been lost. There's status or prestige that might have been lost. There's your place in the world that's been lost. And people grieve for all of those things. Grief doesn't start only after someone dies. I think many medical diagnoses involve a loss of function or a loss of a self-identity as a well, strong person. And each of those losses requires sort of an adaptation of the person who's enduring it. Sometimes the adaptations go for long periods of time. You don't just grieve and be done with it. Grief is something that most of us carry with us through our whole lives. That's not abnormal. Usually the grief diminishes over time, but it may be stirred up by certain events that come and go in our lives. Having a medical diagnosis and getting sicker will bring on often a new wave of grief. People are attached to their homes. We're attached to our lifestyles. We're attached to many aspects of our daily life. And when those change, even if the person who helps you with the dry cleaner stops coming, there's a small feeling of loss there based on kind of perhaps the sort of cheery interaction you had with them for many years while you dropped off your clothes to be cleaned. Divorce is another important one. Retirement is another kind of form of loss. You lose an identity as somebody in the working world. You lose connections with other people. And the most powerful losses in general for us have to do with people. But the idea of a loss of an idea can also be a powerful loss. The fear of the idea of yourself as strong, the idea of yourself as young, the idea of the world as stable at a time when many all the time when many things are changing in the world. All those things can represent losses.
I think most of us are keenly aware when we're grieving the loss of a loved one, for example, but do we recognize when we are grieving the loss of a job or some form of our identity or something else that might be less obvious to us?
Yeah, I think we might feel miserable, but we don't necessarily recognize it because we think of loss and grief as so powerfully connected with the loss of a person. But I think pretty much everybody who goes through retirement grieves some aspects of that. Everybody who goes through a divorce, a lot of the emotional upheaval and turmoil and anxiety and distress has to do with the loss of a partner, the loss of an idea of yourself as someone who has a successful marriage in the course of a divorce, the loss of the security for your children, perhaps of a home, of financial security. But we don't necessarily frame it in this way. And I think it is really helpful to recognize that grieving takes place for anything that you've had and that is gone. And that framing it in that way allows us to be maybe a little bit more gentle with ourselves, to realize that it's a process, to realize that you move through it slowly. It doesn't just go away immediately. And that it is part of the kind of turmoil that we feel with some of these other losses that may occur during the course of a life.
Can you walk us through the impacts of grief?
Yeah, I think that grief has both. It has psychological effects, it has physical effects, it has social effects, it has spiritual effects, it has effects on daily living. And so I'll just run through those. I mean, from the point of view of emotional effects, those are most obvious. We're sad, we may be anxious, we have a sense of longing and yearning for the person who's gone. There's a sense of deep sorrow. There may be a sense of insecurity and fear about the future. And those are all normal responses to loss, and they can be quite profound. And I think it's important to kind of recognize that. The physical responses are often a loss of appetite, a loss of sleep, can be associated with other kinds of loss of patterns of usual behavior, eating differently, and losing interest in sexuality. All of these different elements can be part of a physical reaction to grief. The social effects of grief have to do with a constriction in one's circle, a redefinition of one's relationships with others. If you've been part of a couple and your partner dies, there may be a different kind of social opportunities that you can take part in. You may be invited to less places. You may be invited to different places. So it requires an enormous sort of social readjustment. Family ties are reconfigured. A family may become closer after a loss. It may become more distant, and loss may precipitate conflict and tension and things rising up from the past. I think losses can often induce people to reflect on and question and reframe some of their spiritual or religious beliefs. If there's been if that's a strong orientation in somebody's life, there can be a lot of spiritual questioning and doubt about God, about oneself, about others that can be part of the effects of grief. And finally, there are all kinds of practical changes in impacts on daily living. Just feeling lost, feeling like you don't know where you belong in the world, not knowing how to balance the checkbook. If you have, I don't know if people still use checkbooks very much, but if you use a checkbook, not learning how to take care of your financial situation, not knowing how to fix the sink when it's leaking, all of these different elements, thinking about who's there if you need help, the kind of anxiety and insecurity about feeling alone. And so it really runs the gamut. Some people in the context of loss feel angry and feel betrayed by life, by God, by other people. So there are many different responses that people have that are all part of the normal experience.
Is there any rhyme or reason to how we grieve, you versus me, for example? Is there anything that in particular that drives that process for us?
I think our whole self drives that process, and everybody grieves in their own way and on their own terms. And there's no one right way to grieve and no wrong way to grieve. And I think it's really important to remember because we live in a world where people have ideas about how grief should take place. And there are no rules about this. I think that's really very, very critical. Grief is also influenced by our support systems and who we have to kind of turn to and lean on at a time of vulnerability. It's affected by our past histories with loss, because a grief in the moment brings up all the other losses from the past for most of us. And people who are bringing with them a lot of losses may have a harder time in kind of working through a grieving process in the present. The amount of other, concurrent troubles that the person is having to deal with. Are they having to deal with losing their home or with financial insecurity or with 4 young children who need to be taken care of? All of those other stressors in daily life have an impact on how we experience loss. And I think it's important for us to recognize how many of us are affected by grief and loss, and how ubiquitous it is. So there's some estimates that show that as many as 9 or 10% of people experience a major loss every year. So there's a chance if 10 friends, one of those people that year is going to go through a significant loss. And another way of thinking about this is that in the United States, there are about 3.2 million people who die each year. And experts estimate that each death has a significant impact on about 5 people.
Wow.
And that means that 16 million people a year are in the midst and affected by a loss every year. That's a lot of people. And so being aware of that in our environment and being sort of sensitized to it a little bit can help us be more responsive and compassionate to people we just might casually or even more intimately meet.
That's a great point. Susan, I want to ask you about the mechanics of grief, for lack of a better way of putting that. And I can't help but bring up Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grieving. We hear about those so often. What should we know about that listing and what we can take from it?
Well, Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief were really not focused on people who have lost a loved one to death. They really are focused on the experiences of people dealing with a life-threatening diagnosis. But there are a lot of parallels, and researchers have shown that people who are grieving go through some elements of these different phases. Now, before I say what the phases are, I want to just put some caveats out there because, there's no right way to go through this and no standard way to progress through these phases. And if you feel one phase before you're supposed to, it's fine. Don't worry about it. So I think it's important to not be too strict about thinking about this phase theory. The first phase that was postulated by Elisabeth Kubler-Ross is the phase of denial. And it's a phase of shock and not being able to take in a new reality that is so unthinkable or so disturbing. And we often initially you think about people, how could this be happening? Is this real? Are you sure there's not a mistake? Those kind of reactions are very normal early on in the process of grieving, as someone is just both is transitioning from thinking of things as stable to having to accept this new reality that is so terrible that they don't want to accept it. The next phase after that is a kind of anger. how could this be happening to me? Is God good? Why did this happen? This kind of angry questioning is very much part of anger. Viewing what the medical care a loved one might have received. Did the doctors miss something? Could something else have been done to save them? Those kinds of feelings are an inevitable part of a grieving process. Then there's often a kind of, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross says, bargaining process, or going back and forth process. Well, if I'd got him to the hospital, maybe he would have lived. Or, if I had only been a better person, things would have turned out differently. And there's a lot of questioning and self-doubt in this phase. And it's a very uncomfortable but very normal part of the process to be questioning everything and thinking about how, well, okay, then if I follow this path, then that the doctors say that I need to follow, then this won't happen to me. There are all kinds of those kinds of considerations that go on. And then people kind of move into, and this can happen slowly or more quickly, people enter into the more full impact of what it means to live a life, kind of depression about what has been lost, a deeper sorrow, sadness, a feeling like it'll never get better. And that depression is also a normal part of the grieving process. But it often leads sort of slowly, kind of ineffably into little glimmers of, well, that's the way it is. And I can live with it. And he'll always be with me. And glimmers of what she calls acceptance and making peace with the loss. And it doesn't necessarily come each time in this same order. And even when you're have reached sort of some kind of peace about the death, I'm talking about death more particularly here. There's still feelings about, why did this have to happen? And how can this be my life? So it never entirely goes away. And I think one of the important things to remember is that major losses stay with us for the rest of our lives. And they don't ever entirely go away. They get better over time. They change and evolve. We can continue to have a relationship with the person who's died for the rest of our lives. My mother died more than 40 years ago, and I still think about her in certain contexts and remember her and feel her presence, even though she died. Every time I get my mother used to wash my hair in the kitchen sink. When I go get my hair washed at the beauty salon, I always think about my mother because I'm leaning back on the sink. And those memories are sweet and meaningful, and it allows me to feel kind of close to her, and I wouldn't ever want them to go away. And so there's a sweetness, and there's also a sorrow that comes as peace falls onto us over time. But it can't be hurried, and it has to sort of happen at its own pace and be kind of organic and authentic to us and their relationship. I want to say one thing, because there are other losses where there's a feeling of, well, what a relief. There's a relief that the person is not suffering. There's a relief that you're not having to be a caregiver. There's a relief maybe that somebody with whom you had a very difficult relationship, you don't have to have that relationship anymore. And I think that those emotions are important to accept as well. And if you feel a sense of relief, well, then that's an appropriate feeling for you to be feeling. So again, there's no right way to go through this process. And sometimes it's the strongest emotion, and that's okay.
I want to weave in some questions that are coming in from our attendees as we go. And let's start with this one. Often people go into quote unquote shock when grieving. What are the causes of that, and how should one handle it?
Great question. Shock is a kind of part of denial, and it's part of what Kubler-Ross calls denial, and it's part of the unacceptability of what has happened. That our whole selves are doing everything possible to not accept this new reality. Okay, and it shuts us down in certain ways, and it results in us not being able to process, think, hear things that are said to us, feel anything. And it really is part of the transition from something that wasn't true, was unacceptable, to something that is now reality. And the shock is a kind of numbing, temporary numbing. It gives us a little bit of time to catch up with reality. And it's a normal aspect of the experience. And I think when people are in that state, what they need is our presence. They often need our quiet. They need to be kind of emotionally held, sometimes physically held. And they need to know that there are people who are going to try to get through it with them. But you can't make the shock go away. It goes away in its own time. I think ideally you don't have to make any big decisions in the moments of shock. That it's just a time for quiet, for care, for giving space to the person to begin to process.
Here's another question for you. If you are grieving, what can you say to people who don't understand grief or try to push people along in their grief?
Yeah, it's a good question because our culture has a very, I would say, intolerant attitude towards grief. And there's sort of the idea, well, okay, you have the funeral, you may be sad for a couple weeks, maybe a month or two, but then you're supposed to be on your way back into normal life. And that is not the way it is for most people. There are some people for who it works out. It depends on your relationship with the person who's died and your own emotional configuration. But it's very common for people to make, I think, unintended kind of what feel like unkind responses, like, oh, he's in a better place. Well, how do you know? And it's not a better place from my point of view. And you have these feelings internally. And I think being able to say to a person who doesn't understand, to say that I'm grieving in my own way. I'm doing the best I can. And everybody has their own way of going through this process. And I am not done with my grieving process. I'm still in it, and I need to be in it. And what I need from you is to sort of support me in being in it as long as I need to be.
We'll get back to some more of our audience questions in a moment here, but I want to ask you about prolonged grief disorder. What is that? How is it diagnosed? How is it treated?
Well, I think that this comes from this idea that there's a time limit. And I think there's a general trajectory or course of grief, and that most people go from feeling horrific, sometimes for a long time, to starting to feel a little bit better. And I call them glimmers. They're these little signs of hope that you can begin to look forward to things. You do try something new. You remember somebody with maybe some tears, but also a smile. Then you remember somebody with just the smile and less tears. And so things evolve, and that's a normal part of the grieving process. And I think most people in some way are somewhat better after 6 months or so. And people are even better after a year. The line of of the definition of prolonged grief disorder, which is really intense grief that does not evolve and that makes the person unable to enjoy their life. That's what I would beyond. And it's sort of diagnosed around 6 months. I don't think it's a useful number because some people need 7 months and some people need 4 months. So I think the time frame is not appropriate. But I think the main thing about prolonged grief is a person is stuck. A person can't move forward. A person is deeply distressed all the time. And there are people who live in prolonged grief for decades. Mm. They can't make any changes in their home. Their dead wife's slippers are still under the bed 20 years later. I've seen people like this, that there is no adjustment of any kind to their new reality of that person not being here. And it's a terrible place to be. And so it's important to kind of notice when somebody gets stuck. The other big thing that causes people to be stuck is depression. And grief is not depression. And usually people who are grieving are able to enjoy some small things temporarily. They are able to have maybe accepted the worst moments. Most of the time they have some glimmer that, yeah, I know it's going to get better. People with depression have no sense things are going to get better. There's nothing that gives them pleasure. There's nothing that they can enjoy. And there's this deep sense of darkness and of foreverness about the state they're in. They're often not eating, they're not sleeping, which also happen in grieving, but it continues longer. In grief, it's usually transitory. They may not be able to think as clearly as possible, as usual, and they may lose interest and pleasure in the things that they normally like to do. So depression is a little bit different. And I guess the way I look at it is that if someone seems stuck and can't move forward, if someone can't enjoy anything and can't find any glimmer of goodness in the world, that those are probably indications that it would at least be helpful to consult with a mental health professional and to have someone see whether there's more that could be done to help that person move forward in their grief. Medications are not effective, particularly with grief, but they are very effective with depression. And so we don't want to miss identifying a person who has grief that has progressed to become depression, because we can really help them. And similarly, there are treatments that have been developed for people with prolonged grief disorder that can be helpful to them. So we don't want to miss that. But it's the stuckness, I think, is the main feature of prolonged grief disorder.
If someone does, in fact, reach that juncture where they feel it would be helpful to seek some professional help, how do they go about doing that? Where do you find a grief specialist?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And I have to say, it's really hard. The first place I'd start for most people is with a primary care doctor. A primary care doctor should be your sort of triage person for these kinds of things. And the person who you see does not have to be a grief specialist. It just has to be somebody who is familiar and comfortable in helping people through loss. And that includes most social workers, psychologists, and psychiatrists. I would also say that given that about half of people who die from serious illness now die in hospice, it's really important to recognize that hospice has bereavement specialists. It's required by Medicare that every hospice provider have a bereavement expert who's part of their team, and that bereavement care be provided for 13 months after the loved one's death. So if you are someone whose loved one died in a hospice program, you have access through your health insurance and Medicare to bereavement support. There are also bereavement support groups that exist in the community, often run by hospices. And those are things that either your primary care doctor or you can search out online. And I would encourage people to consider at least giving a bereavement support group a try if you're feeling like you might be struggling and need some additional perspective on what you're going through. Not everybody's a group person, but if you go to a bereavement group and it feels okay, stick with it. It's helpful for lots of people. If you go and it just doesn't feel like the right place, either try another one or see somebody more one-on-one.
Let me weave in a few more questions here. How might the grieving process be different following the loss of a loved one to suicide?
Oh, dear. The grieving process for somebody who dies with suicide is usually unusually hard. Because there is the sense often of anger and hurt and betrayal of the people who are left behind. There's also often the sense of not of guilt, of not having known or recognized that the person was on the edge of ending their lives, of feeling, what could I have done differently? And there again, I think support groups, and there are in many communities support groups for people who are bereaved by suicide, can be enormously helpful. Suicide is a harder loss to recover from for most people. It's very traumatizing, and partly because it's so unexpected in most cases, and the elements of grief and guilt and anger and sorrow are profound, and they often can benefit from some professional help.
Another very specific question. How can we help school-age children and teens manage the loss of a parent?
Yeah. Well, this is such an important question, and it's one that's very kind of close to my heart, because I think that having cared for adult patients my whole life, we often forget that many adults, younger adults, have young children, and older adults have older children. And so that when loss is a family experience, and the family who's often most vulnerable are the children. And so one of the things that I think is really important that we can do, that we can try to do, is to prepare children for a loss. We know that preparation helps people cope. Things that are unexpected are much harder and more prolonged for people to kind of deal effectively with. And so we need, whether they're very young children or middle school children or high schoolers or college students or young adults or older young adults, preparation is going to help people adjust. And I think that involves talk for those people who have who have a serious illness where there's a possibility that they could die. I think that helping people understand that is really important. With young children, it's somewhat different because children don't understand death for the first few years of their lives. And so and they can't prepare for that period of time also. And so the process needs to be very much tailored to what age the child is. For many kids don't understand death until they're 6 or 7. Or they understand death. They say, they understand the word, but it means that, he went to sleep. He's, he'll be back at some point. He's on a trip, he'll be back. And there's a lot of magical thinking that goes on in younger children. So I think the idea of death and the preparation for death needs to be simplified for children of young children of parents who have a serious illness or who die. And I think that there are a number of really excellent books that are out there that I think can be helpful. And we can put those in the reading list, which I think we'll include at the very end.
Definitely.
But I think that the idea is, I'm just making a note to myself to remember that. But I think that the idea is to, and I can't go through all the different developmental stages, but you need to get a sense of, you look up, what does a 3-year-old understand? What does a 6-year-old understand about death? You'll find information that you can use to help you tailor kind of how you talk to that child about a loved one's death. The other thing I would say is that teenagers are a special case in a lot of ways. They're trying to move away. That's developmentally appropriate, but a death pulls them back to the family. And there's often a lot of tension and conflict between those two different orientations. And I think that being aware of and accepting of that kind of going back and forth for teenagers. I think one of the biggest things that parents do in these situations is they try to protect the child. And this is where the idea of preparation is so critical. Protecting the child and not letting them know that a parent is sick or that something bad is likely to come isn't protecting them. It may actually be making things tougher for the kid. And so I think it's really important to protecting the child in some way involves preparing the child when that is possible. And it's a hard thing to do. It takes a lot of courage to talk to a child, a young child especially, about an impending loss. But I think in general, it tends to make the child feel more protected and better prepared for the loss.
We tend to have a lot of clinicians in our webinar audiences, and questions come in from, I assume, one of these clinicians. What can mental health professionals do for clients who are grieving a loss without feeling, as the clinician, that you're focusing too much on the death?
Well, I don't know what's focusing too much on the death, and it seems like when people are grieving, that's the central experience that they're having. And I think that while some people get stuck in their grief, I don't think we as clinicians contribute to people getting stuck in their grief in general. That I think that I think we need to be with people in their grief and not worry so much about our own sense of don't worry about our worry that they're going to get stuck in their grief or that they're not moving forward. I think that's we tend to want people to keep moving forward. And a big part of the early experiences that go on for months of grief is a feeling of being stuck. And if we're not willing to be stuck with our patients in that hard grieving, we can't help them.
I want to ask you a question about supporting somebody who is grieving. Oftentimes we don't know what to say, and so we say nothing. Is that the right strategy? What guidance can you give us on that front?
Yeah, I think it's definitely not the right strategy, and to say nothing. And the simplest thing to say is, "I'm so sorry for your loss." Okay, it's very simple. You can never go wrong saying that. Okay, and oftentimes you don't have to say that much more about it. One of the most healing things that one can do in a context that is appropriate for this is to, especially is to say, tell me more about your relationship with so-and-so who'd recently died. People who are grieving want to and need to talk about their grief. Okay. And we think that it might harm them. It might make them so sad. It might remind them. There's no reminding. It's there when people are acutely grieving. Shakespeare said, "Give sorrow words." And I think that is really the mantra that we should use by helping the bereaved give sorrow words. And it's never wrong, 10 years later, to bring up the name of the person who's died. It doesn't remind people. It's a sense of being joined in remembering. You don't forget the people who've died. They're with you always. And if someone else remembers them, it can feel very, very meaningful. So I think the important things are, I would say, and I'll give you some do's and some don'ts here.
Please.
Don't say, call me anytime. People who are bereaved have a big problem. It's not a problem. I have a lot of difficulty in reaching out. We should reach out to them. Could I take you to the movies next weekend? Could I bring you dinner? Would you like to go for a walk? Is it okay if I call you once a week for a while? Those kinds of things, the person can always say no. Those kinds of things of being active in your outreach are really helpful. I think, let me know if there's anything I can do can feel like just too high a mountain for the bereaved person to climb. And I think that's important to recognize. I think reminding people they can take as long as they need, that there's no timetable, that every grief is individual. There's no right or wrong way to do this is important. Just being there when someone is sad is really important. We don't even have to talk about what you're going through if you don't want to. I'm here to talk if you want to, but we can just sit, we can read together, we can watch a movie together. Being there matters. I think people really value hearing the name of the person who's died. Okay? The name is about the person, and having the person brought into the dialogue tells the person who's grieving that person still is important. Recognizing, especially for someone who was a caregiver during a serious illness, you did an amazing job caring for your loved one. And, everybody who knows you knows that that's the case. And I hope that you can find some kind of comfort in knowing that you gave him or her the best possible end of life. Just those kinds of affirmations are really, really, really important. And I think the things that maybe are not so good to say are, she's in a better place. Be strong. God took her for a reason. Be patient. It's hard to be patient when you're grieving. Don't say, are you getting over it? Because it feels like being hurried along. But I think there's a lot that we can do. The most important thing is not running away. Move towards the grief. That's always the right thing to do in these situations.
Well, I love how practical the tips are that you've just shared. Let's shift the focus from an individual supporting somebody who's grieving to that individual that is grieving. What are some coping strategies, for example, some practical coping strategies that we might use?
Yeah, I think if you're grieving, it's really, really important to allow yourself to lean on other people. That's not something that most of us are that comfortable doing, but we need to grieve in community. And that's why we have rituals like Shivas, like funerals, like memorial services, like remembrances, because we need to grieve not alone, but in community. And that's really important. And there's no right number of different remembrances that you can plan. There's no right timing for any of it. Many people remember a loved one on the anniversary of their death. That there are many different ways of doing this, but it's all good, is what I would say. I think in the immediate aftermath, be gentle with yourself. Try as much as you can to stick with your usual routines and patterns. It's very hard. You may not be sleeping, you may not want to eat, but trying to keep with routines is very helpful. Exercise, as impossible as it might feel, taking a walk with a friend, just getting your body tired out is helpful in these situations. there's often a tendency to want to numb the pain in some ways. And there are many rituals and customs that involve alcohol. And alcohol is not our friend when we're grieving. And I think to be aware of that, and it's a risk for people who are grieving to turn to alcohol too much for help in the grieving process. It doesn't help it, it impedes it. And I'm not saying be a teetotaler here, but I'm saying drink mindfully, be careful of drinking. Don't push other people to drink in this situation. I think it's a good thing to reach out to your primary care physician when you're grieving, because grief has physiologic effects. People's blood pressure can go up. People may be more vulnerable to, other illnesses. And it's important for the person who, is kind of your coordinator and your overseer of your health to know that your body and your whole self has been through a trauma. I think, trying to keep to these routines, taking good care of yourself, setting things up with people if they're not setting them up with you. Distraction is not a bad thing in this situation. It helps you get through the time that you need to heal. Allowing yourself to remember is a very important part of the grieving process. And so I think that those are the main things that are helpful in terms of self-care.
Here's a very specific question that came in. Is there an appropriate age for a child to attend a funeral?
Depends on the child. It really depends on the child. It depends on the family. And I think young children with appropriate support can attend funerals. And it's just the child's developmental level is important. But the key thing, if you're bringing a young child to a funeral, is have someone at the funeral who's not really, super involved with the event. Somebody who's a little at some distance, who the child knows, who could take the child away if it becomes too much for them, so that you as a parent or you as a close friend don't have to be worried about the child's well-being, and that there's somebody there. Maybe it's a teacher from school who could come and be there if the child is getting restless or upset, so you don't have to worry about the child, and so that the child doesn't have to stay if they're uncomfortable. And I would say always take the child's lead.
One of our attendees would like me to ask you about helping someone who rejects our help. And I'm going to extrapolate from that might be a situation where I am uniquely qualified to help that individual, and that individual is not open to my helping them. What are your thoughts in terms of how we best support that person?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I always think about is, am I helping in the right way? Am I trying to help in the way that suits that person? Okay. And because we need to reflect on ourselves a little bit in this process. But assuming that you can answer that question, that I think I'm doing the best I can here, and I think I'm kind of paying attention to these issues. I think that continuing to reach out and sort of, would it be okay? I hear you that you don't want help right now, that you don't want to talk about this right now, but would it be okay if I continue to reach out to you every couple of weeks and just check in? So I think remaining present is a really important thing. I think trying to assure yourself as much as you can that the person is safe. And I say that because suicide is not common after a death when someone is grieving, but it can happen. And if you have worries about that, I think it's important to be direct about it. And sometimes it involves getting other family members involved, like, so-and-so isn't wanting to talk to me, or a family member or a friend or someone who is closer to the person. And so I think it needs to be very sort of individually adjusted. But part of it, I think the most important thing is continued checking in and trying to be there. unless the person refuses you. And you can't make someone accept your help. And so I think there may be people who, need to go out and, I knew somebody who needed to just go out and brush cut. And he didn't want to talk about it. He couldn't talk about it. And that just physical activity was his way of coping. And so it varies quite a lot in what people need to do. And we need to kind of explore what would be helpful. If they say nothing would be helpful, is say, could I check in? And then also be aware of the safety issue.
I feel like I'd be remiss not to ask you about the pandemic. So many folks lost to COVID-19 in such a short period of time. How did that impact our societal grieving, if you will?
Yeah. Well, I think we haven't grieved as a society adequately for the vast number of people who were impacted by COVID and who died from it. And I think that many people, because of COVID, occurring in close quarters, lost multiple people in their families and were multiply bereaved. That experience is an overwhelming experience. And so that they were struggling not just with many deaths, but multiple deaths and maybe long COVID and so on. The other thing is that deaths differentially affected rich and poor communities, white and minority communities. And there are usually less resources in those communities to support people. And so I think that being aware of that, and we need to build better systems to support grieving globally within our country and also globally. But I think being aware of that people who had tougher experiences and had more losses and more personal vulnerability and more other stressors during the COVID pandemic are going to be more vulnerable and are going to need more support.
On a somewhat related note, in terms of global issues, there are a couple of wars underway right now. We're seeing a lot of loss. I think some people are having difficulty processing that loss as well.
I think that's right. And I think that, again, it's the magnitude of losses that affect people. It's what the current losses, how they resonate or don't resonate with past losses, family experiences, and so on. And so I think this is sort of a time where there's a lot of anxiety and a lot of loss in the world that makes us all extra conscious of some of our own losses. And it's a time to be, I think, in lots of ways, extra tolerant and extra compassionate towards each other.
You've been working in this field for so long. I have to ask you about the trend line, if you will, in terms of addressing grief and loss in a healthy way. Is it moving in the right direction? Are we doing a better job collectively? Are we doing a better job of educating our educators and clinicians and others in terms of how best to help people navigate grief?
That's a hard question. I think we are doing a little better, but I think we also have a long ways to go. And I think that hospice, palliative care, people beginning to sort of speak out more about their own grief. President Biden spoke recently about the loss of his son on a podcast, the loss of his children and his wife. Actually, it's more than his son. And that there's some destigmatization of grief that is going on culturally. But I think it's primarily viewed as a personal experience, and that our culture is uncomfortable with the strong emotions that it can trigger. I'll also say that I don't think that our educational systems for clinicians or for human beings do a very good job in including grief in what we teach to younger people. and to prepare people for the inevitable losses that come with living a life or caring for other people. And I think that people are hungry for help in dealing with this issue. And that's partly a reason why I wanted to appear on this podcast with you, because I want to contribute to that. And I think it's such an important agenda. But we need to do a better job of sort of bringing it out from the dark recesses of our culture, of our families, of our society, and into conversation with each other. That's where the healing is.
We're just about out of time, and I do want to ask you for your favorite resources on this front. Books, websites, organizations. Where would you point our viewers right now for additional information?
Well, there's some great books, about grief that I think have been very, very helpful to me, and I think to other people. And there's help in poetry. There's help in fiction. There's help in autobiography. There's help in medicine, in psychiatry, in sociology. So, there's a lovely book called Grieving: A Beginner's Guide. There's a book about grief in children called Grief is the Thing with Feathers. There's another book about finding meaning after a loss. There's a beautiful narrative about loss called A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis, about the loss of his wife. There's another book called The Art of Losing. There's a beautiful book of poetry called All in the End is Harvest. There's another book of poetry by Donald Hall called Without, about the loss of his wife, the poet Jane Kenyon. So there are many resources that are available and that I think can bring perspective, comfort, solidarity to people who are going through this experience.
Susan, this hour has flown by, and I'd love to pick up our conversation down the road. I also want to thank you for being our guest today. We so appreciate your loaning us your time and your expertise. We covered a lot of important ground.
Thank you. It was an honor to be here, and I hope it was helpful to people who listened.
Thanks again. And to those of you watching, thank you for your interest in our educational webinar series. We hope you'll come back for our future sessions, and we wish you a wonderful day.